don't know if you can see that very well, but this is Plymouth Harbor. This is where this message was given to me. I specifically went over there to find one thing and came across something else. So I'm going to show you what this looks like. These are the graves of some of the pilgrims. Some of these graves date to 1690. It was quiet that day. In a minute here, I'm going to turn and find William Bradford's tomb. Now, if you know anything about history, that is Hebrew. That is actually right there, God's written out name in Hebrew from 1600s. Israel did not exist in the 1600s, and nobody spoke Hebrew. He died in 1657. This is another view right there. Now, why would a man from the 1600s have God's name written out in Hebrew on his tombstone? This actual monument was rebuilt in 1800, but Israel didn't exist then either. They didn't exist until 1948. So that's perplexing enough to think those guys knew about Hebrew and the Hebrew culture more than what we know. That proves they worshiped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? That should be in schools, but it's not. Now, I knew this existed, but I wanted to see it for myself. But God didn't send me there for this. This was another grave I found out there. John Howland. Now, if you remember the video, he's the guy that fell off the boat. Has anybody heard of him? John Howland. I guarantee you after this, you will think about him more. Right down here, it's hard to read, so I'm going to tell you what it says. He was a godly man and an ancient professor in the ways of Christ. He was one of the first comers to this land and the last man who was left from a ship that was called the Mayflower. One of the first guys here and the last one from that boat to live. And he studied the ancient ways of Christ. Right? That should excite some people to think that we are rooted. Here's another picture of his grave. It doesn't even have, it's mixed around with all these other things. So, he was born in 1591. Died 1672. No one's ever heard of him, right? So here's the thing. He was a slave on this boat. He was called indentured servant. He was, in the Bible, a slave is called an indentured servant. God makes a way out. You can only hold somebody as a slave for 7 years, and then you have to set them free, unless they bond themselves to you when it's time to free themselves. That's called a bondservant. They would actually go to the doorpost of the house and run a thing through their ear, drawing blood, saying, I want to be your servant for life. But God makes a way out, so there is no way to hold somebody for life. That didn't exist until later on, and it's a whole other story. So he's a slave. Keep that in mind. And he's on a boat full of people running from religious persecution. Okay? Rough way to go, right? Now, in the cartoon we just watched, he falls off. Now think about this boat bobbing around. They had to raise the sails up because the wind was ripping it apart. You would think that they would be, in their minds, they're thinking, are we in God's will? Are we sure we're supposed to be doing this? Because we just left to come over here to worship God and we hit this awful storm. We're crammed into a tiny boat. It's rocking around like crazy. They go to the restroom on this thing. There's nowhere for it to go, so it's sloshing around everywhere. People are vomiting on each other. some people die, right? And here this guy, a slave, manages to make his way up to the top, and then he falls off. You got to be thinking in your mind, what else can go wrong, right? I must be out of God's will because all this bad is happening to me. But what happens is, there's a book called Of Plymouth Plantation that was written. It's a diary. William Bradford, that tombstone I just showed you with God's name on it, he wrote a diary of this whole trip. So he details what happened with this, and it actually happened on a specific day. He falls off the boat. On the way down, because the sails were up, the ropes were hanging into the water. The guy grabs one of the ropes, and he holds on. Now this guy had really, at this point, no real reason to want to live, because he's a slave on a sinking boat in the middle of a storm, in the middle of nowhere, going somewhere he doesn't know where he's going, right? So what reason would there be to hold on at that point? How many of us would let go right now? Right? So in the book, William Bradford says, it pleased God that he caught a hold of the topsail hailer, which hung overboard and ran out the length. Yet he held his hold, though he was many fathoms under the water, until he was hauled up by the same rope to the brim of the water, and his life was saved. September 6th, 1620. Now keep this in mind. A fathom is almost 2 meters, 6 feet, 1.9 meters. Many fathoms underwater means he was about 12 feet below the surface of the water, being dragged by this boat in a storm. Right? So now you have the water pushing against you. You can't see anything. You can't hear anything. And you're being drugged. And the only thing he had was his grip. But he held on. Why? Because he knew where he was going. So here's the fascinating thing about this is we don't know how long he was there, because the people on the boat had to haul him up. First they had to realize he was missing. They're bouncing around the boat too. So it could have been 10 minutes, could have been an hour, we don't really know. Right? But all we know is that he held on in an almost impossible situation. When he does finally get hauled back up, he's still a slave. He's still, nothing changed. He's still the same person he was before he fell over. He's still on a boat that's broken in the middle of a storm. Had to ride it out. But now he has more experience. Right? When they finally come to Plymouth, they land, they have to make this society now. It's a wild area, no one knows anything. They have to make a settlement. Through the first winter, 50 of them die. Almost half of the people die for the first winter. So you got to think the survivors are going, we are definitely in the wrong here. We missed the boat somewhere, right? Because all this bad wouldn't be happening if we were in God's perfect will. But they ended up surviving. They built Plymouth society. It's still standing. This is the colony. John Howland, the guy that fell over, when he comes back up, he's still a slave. He has to work 6 more years. But he does that, and he earns his freedom. He earns his freedom. So he's no longer a slave now. And he helped build a society. Next thing, he becomes high-ranking in the society, and he helps institute a feast with the Wampanoag Indians. What do we call that? Thanksgiving. This slave with nothing to live for is directly related to something you do every year. Once that happens, he works his way up to be secretary to the governor of Plymouth. He gets married. A woman named Elizabeth Tilley. They have 10 children. Those 10 children become prosperous, and then he has 88 grandchildren. A slave with nothing to live for, whose only goal was to make it across so he could serve God, now has 88 grandkids. Those 88 grandkids become prosperous. I'm going to show you direct descendants of this man, and you'll recognize some of them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, George H.W. Bush, George Bush, Jeb Bush, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he's a poet, Anthony Perkins, Chevy Chase, Joseph Smith, founder of the Mormon Church, the Baldwin brothers, Ted Danson, Dr. Benjamin Spock. Anybody know who he is? He read all these baby books on how to take care of children. Sarah Palin, Christopher Lloyd, Humphrey Bogart. Have you heard of any of those people? None of those people would have existed if he had let go. 3 U.S. presidents would not have existed if this slave, with nothing to live for, gave up. The only thing he had to hold on to was a rope and his faith. And for that, all those people exist. Now, I want to show you something else. This is the country of Slovenia. Right there. This is Italy, Germany, France. Right there, the little dark spot, Slovenia. The reason why I say that is this year, the population of Slovenia is 2,081,000. Why do I say that? Because it's an entire sovereign country whose population is 2,081,000. 4 centuries later, after John Howland falls off a boat, more than 2 million people now can trace their lineage back to him. An entire nation of people exist today because a slave with nothing to live for on a broken boat in the middle of a storm, running from persecution, being drugged underwater, cannot hear anything, cannot see anything, nothing to live for besides I'm going to hold on to this rope and my God. And now an entire nation of people exist because of him. Thanksgiving exists because of him. America was formed. America that was formed out of the northern colonies exists because of this guy. If that doesn't show you how important you are, because you don't know how important your life is on the future. You can't give up. You can't let go. Your life could end up being the blessing of a nation. Jacob became Israel. Right? So think about that next time you're sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner. I bet you'll think about this guy. And think about how bad, whatever it is you're going through now, does it compare? And what was it that he had that you actually have would cause you to hold on? How many of us want to just give up because I lost my keys, or it's snowing today, and I'm supposed to do this, or I'm going to go to Kings Island tomorrow, and it's raining, and we want to give up on God so easy.
Yes.
And here this guy, knowing, he had to know, even if I come up from this, I'm still a slave. I got to work off my debt. You don't go to the altar and immediately erase everything. You go to the altar, you get saved. You get a guarantee from the king, your life is spared. And what did Solomon say? But you have to prove yourself worthy. And that's where you go to the labor and figure out who you are. I guarantee you, this guy knew who he was. Being drug under the water, he's like, I'm still somebody. I'm still worth something. I'm going to hold on until I get my life saved. Right? And we have that same God in us. We serve the same God he did. So don't give up. Hold on.